Book the First. Today and Tomorrow. The Age of Frustration Dawns. Part 1. A Chronological Note. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the story of mankind upon this planet undergoes a change of phase. It broadens out. It unifies. It ceases to be a tangle of more and more interrelated histories, and it becomes plainly and consciously one history. There is a complete confluence of racial, social, and political destinies. With that, a vision of previously unsuspected possibilities opens to the human imagination. And that vision brings with it an immense readjustment of ideas. The first phase of that readjustment is necessarily destructive. The conceptions of life and obligation that have served and satisfied even the most vigorous and intelligent personalities hitherto, conceptions that were naturally partial, sectarian, and limited, begin to lose, decade by decade, their credibility and their directive force. They fade. They become attenuated. It is an age of increasing mental uneasiness, of forced beliefs, hypocrisy, cynicism, abandon, and impatience. What has been hitherto a final and impenetrable background of conviction in the rightness of the methods of behavior characteristic of the national or local culture of each individual becomes, as it were, a dissolving and ragged curtain. Behind it appear, vague and dim at first, and refracted and distorted by the slow dissolution of the traditional veils, the intimations of the type of behavior necessary to the single world community in which we live today. Until the Chronological Institute has completed its present labors of revision and defined the cardinal dates in our social evolution, it is best to refer our account of the development of man's mind and will throughout this hectic period of human experience to the clumsy and irrelevant computation by centuries before and after the Christian era that is still current. As we have explained more fully in a previous book, we inherit the system of historical pigeonholes from Christendom. That arbitrary checkerwork of 100-year blocks was imposed upon the entire Mediterranean and Atlantic literatures for 2,000 years. And it still distorts the views of history of all but the alertest minds. The young student needs to be constantly on his guard against its false divisions. As Peter Lightfoot has remarked, we talk of the 18th century, and we think of fashions and customs and attitudes that are characteristic of a period extending from the Treaty of Westphalia in Christian era 1642 to the Napoleonic collapse in Christian era 1815. We talk of the 19th century, and the pictures and images evoked are those of the gas lighting and steam transport era, from after the distressful years of post-Napoleonic recovery to the immense shock of the World War in Christian era 1914. The phase 20th century again calls forth images of the aeroplane, the electrification of the world, and so forth. But an aeroplane was an extremely rare object in the air until 1914. The first got up in 1905. And the replacement of the last steam railway train and the last steamship was not completed until the 1940s. It is a tiresome waste of energy to oblige each generation of young minds to learn first of all and any unmeaning pattern of centuries and then to correct that first crude arrangement, so that this long-needed revision of our chronology is one that will be very welcome to every teacher. Then, from the very outset, he or she will be able to block out the history of our race in significant masses. The Chronological Institute is setting about its task with a helpful publicity, inviting discussion from every angle. It is proposing to divide up as much of the known history of our race as is amenable to annual reckoning into a series of eras of unequal length. Naturally, the choice of these eras is the cause of some extremely lively and interesting interchanges. Most of us have our own private estimates of the values of events, and many issues affecting the earlier civilized communities remain in a state of animated unsettlement. Our chronology is now fairly sure as to the year for most important events in the last 4,000 years, and thanks largely to the minute and patient labors of the Selwyn-Cornford Committee for Alluvial Research, to the decade for another 100 centuries. So far as the last 3,000 years are concerned, little doubt remains now that the main dividing points to be adopted will be, first, the epoch of Alexander and the Hellenistic conquests, which will begin the phase of the great Helleno-Latin monetary imperialism in the Western world, the Helleno-Latin era. This will commence at the crossing of the Hellespont by Alexander the Great and end with the Battle of Yarmouk, 636 Christian era, or the surrender of Jerusalem to the Caliph Omar, 638 Christian era. Next will come the epoch of Muslim and Mongol pressure on the West, which opened the era of feudal Christendom, vis-a-vis with feudal Islam, the era of Asiatic predominance. This ends with the Battle of Lepanto, 1571 Christian era. Then, thirdly, there will follow the epoch of the Protestant and Catholic counter-reformations, which inaugurated the era of the competing sovereign states with organized standing armies, the era of European predominance, or, as it may also be called, the era of national sovereignty. Finally, comes the catastrophe of the World War of 1914, when the outward drive of the new economic methods of Atlantic civilizations had developed gave way under the internal stresses of European nationalism. That war and its long-drawn sequel released the human mind to the potentialities and dangers of an imperfectly Europeanized world, a world which had unconsciously become one single interlocking system, while still obsessed by the Treaty of Westphalia and the idea of competing sovereign states. This mental shock and release marks the beginning of the era of the modern state. The opening phase of this latest era is this age of frustration which we are now about to deal. That is the first age of the era of the modern state. A second age, but not a new era, began with the Declaration of Megève, which was accepted by the general common sense of mankind 47 years ago. This closed the age of frustration, which lasted therefore a little short of a century and a half. The title page for the first publication of this history is Christian Era 2106. Before many editions have been exhausted, that will be changed to Modern Era 192, or Modern Era 189, or Modern Era 187, according to whether our chronologists decide upon 1914, the date of the outbreak of the Great War, or 1917, the beginning of the social revolution in Russia, or 1919, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, as the conclusive opening of the age of frustration and the conflict for world unity. The second date seems at present to be the more practicable one. In Christian Era 1914, the concept of an organized world order did not seem to be within the sphere of human possibility. In Christian Era 1919, it was an active power in a steadily increasing proportion of human brains. The modern state had been conceived. It was germinating. One system, the Soviet system in Russia, was already claiming to be a world system. To most of the generation which suffered it, the Great War seemed to be purely catastrophe and loss. To us, who see those hideous years in perspective and in proportion to the general dullness and baseness of apprehension out of which that conflict arose, the destruction of life and substance, unprecedented as they were, has none of that overwhelming quality. We see it as a clumsy, involuntary release from outworn assumptions by their reduction to tragic absurdity, and as a practically unavoidable step, therefore, in the dialectic of human destiny. Part 2. How the idea and hope of the modern world state first appeared. The essential difference between the world before the Great War and the world after it lay in this, that before that storm of distress and disillusionment, the clear recognition that a worldwide order and happiness, in spite of contemporary distresses, was within the reach of mankind, was confined to a few exceptional persons, while after the catastrophe it had spread to an increasing multitude. It had become a desperate hope and desire, and at last a working conviction that made organized mass action possible. Even those who apprehended this idea before the epoch of the Great War seem to have propounded it with what impresses us today as an almost inexplicable timidity and feebleness. Apart from the great star of Shelley, which shines the brighter as his successors dwindle in perspective, there is a flavor of unreality about all these pre-war assertions of a possible world order. In most of them, the Victorian terror of extravagance is dominant, and the writer simpers and laughs at his own suggestions in what was evidently supposed to be a very disarming manner. Hardly any of these prophets dared believe in their own reasoning. Maxwell Brown has recently disinterred a pamphlet, The Great Analysis, date 1912, in which a shrewd and reasoned forecast of the primary structure of the modern state, quite amazingly prescient for the time, was broached with the utmost timidity, without even an author's name. It was a scheme to revolutionize the world, and the writer would not put his name to it. He confesses, because it might make him ridiculous. Here, for once, the editor knows better than the writer of the history. This pamphlet was written by William Archer, the dramatic critic, and reprinted under its author's name with a preface by Gilbert Murray in 1931. Apparently, the book collectors of the years ahead are going to miss this book. Maxwell Brown's entertaining Modern State Prophets Before the Great War is an exhaustive study of the psychological processes by which this idea, which is now the foundation of our contemporary life, gradually ousted its opposite of combative patriotism and established itself as a predictable and necessary form of action for men of goodwill a century and a half ago. He traces the idea almost to its germ. So far from being pacific, were dreams of universal conquest. He tells of its age-long struggle with everyday usage and practical common sense. In the first of his huge supplementary volumes, he gives thousands of quotations going back far beyond the beginnings of the Christian era. All the monotheistic religions were, in spirit, world-state religions. He examines the Tower of Babel myth as the attempt of some primordial cosmopolitan, some seer before the dawn, to account for the divisions of mankind. There is strong reason now for ascribing this history to Emerson Gudeke of Nippur, the early Sumerian fabulist. Maxwell Brown shows how the syncretic religious developments, due to the growth of the early empires and the official pooling of gods, led necessarily to monotheism. From at least the time of Buddha onward, the sentiment, if not the living faith, in human brotherhood, always existed somewhere in the world. But its extension from a mere sentiment and a fluctuating sympathy for the stranger to the quality of a practicable enterprise was a very recent process indeed. The necessary conditions were not satisfied. In the briefer studies of human innovations that preceded his more important contributions to human history, Maxwell Brown has shown how for the past 10,000 years at least, since the Cro-Magnards stamped their leather robes and tents, the art of printing reappeared and disappeared again and again, never culminating in the printed book and all its consequences, never obtaining a primary importance in human doings until the 15th century Christian era. He has assembled the evidence for man's repeated abortive essays in flying from the 4th Dynasty gliders recently found at Bidrashan, the shattered Yu-Chow machine, and the interesting wreckage, ornaments, and human remains found last year in Maribala Bay. These last were first remarked in 2104 Christian era, after an earthquake in the deep-sea photographs of the survey aeroplane Crawford, and they were subsequently sought and recovered by the divers of the submarine Slave Minnie, belonging to the Naples Biological Station. They have now been identified by Professor Giulio Marinetti as the remains of the legendary glider of Daedalus and Icarus. Maxwell Brown has also traced the perpetual discovery and rediscovery of America from the days of the Alisund tablets and the early Chinese inscriptions in the caves near Bahai Koki, to the final establishment of uninterrupted communications across the Atlantic by the Western Europeans in the 15th century Christian era. In all, there are 16 separate ineffectual discoveries of America either from the East or from the West, now on record, and there may have been many others that left no trace behind them. These earlier cases of human enterprise and inadequacy help us to understand the long struggle of the Age of Frustration and the difficulty our ancestors found in achieving what is now so obviously the only sane arrangement of human affairs upon this planet. The fruitlessness of all these premature inventions is very easily explained. First, in the case of the transatlantic passage, either the earlier navigators who got to America never got back, or, if they did get back, they were unable to find the necessary support and means to go again before they died. Or, they had had enough of hardship and they perished in a second attempt. Their stories were distorted into fantastic legends and substantially disbelieved. It was, indeed, a quite futile adventure to get to America until the keeled sailing ship, the science of navigation, and the mariner's compass had been added to human resources. Then again, in the matter of printing, it was only when the Chinese had developed the systematic manufacture of abundant cheap paper sheets in standard sizes that the printed book and its consequent release of knowledge became practically possible. Finally, the delay in the attainment of flying was inevitable because before men could progress beyond precarious gliding, it was necessary for metallurgy to reach a point at which the internal combustion engine could be made. Until then, they could build nothing strong enough and light enough to battle with the eddies of the air. In an exactly parallel manner, the conception of one single human community organized for collective service to the commonwealth had to wait until the rapid evolution of the means of communication could arrest and promise to defeat the disintegrative influence of geographical separation. That rapid evolution came at last in the 19th century, and it has been described already in a preceding chapter of this world history. Steam power, oil power, electric power, the railway, the steamship, the aeroplane, transmission by wire and aerial transmission followed each other very rapidly. They knit together the human species as it had never been knit before. Insensibly, in less than a century, the utterly impracticable became not merely a possible adjustment, but an urgently necessary adjustment if civilization was to continue. Now the cardinal prominence of the Great War in history lies in this, that it demonstrated the necessity of that adjustment. It was never considered to be necessary before. Recognition lagged behind accomplishment. None of the pre-war world state prophets betrays any sense of necessity. They make their polite and timid gestures towards human unity as something nice and desirable indeed, but anything but imperative. The clearest demand for worldwide cooperation before the war came from the Second International, and even after the war, and after the vague and vacillating adumbration of a federal superstate by the League of Nations at Geneva, most of even the most advanced writers seem to have been still under the impression that the utmost adjustment needed was some patching up of the current system, so as to prevent or mitigate war and restrain the insurrectionary urge of the unprosperous. Even the communist movement, which, as we had told already, had been able by a conspiracy of accidents to seize upon Russia and demonstrate the value of its theories there, lapsed from, rather than advanced towards, cosmopolitan socialism. Its theories, as we have shown, were hopelessly inadequate for its practical needs. The development of its ideology was greatly hampered by the conservative dogmatism imposed upon it by the incurable egotism of Marx. His intolerance, his innate bad manners, his vain insistence that he had produced a final doctrine to put beside Darwinism, cast a long shadow of impatience and obducery upon the subsequent development of communism. He was bitterly jealous of the utopian school of socialism, and so until Lenin faced the urgencies of power, the orthodox Marxists took a quite idiotic pride in a plainless outlook. Overthrow capitalism, he said, and what could happen but millennial bliss? Communism insisted indeed upon the necessity of economic socialization, but, until it attained power in Russia, without a glance at its technical difficulties, it produced its belated and ill-proportioned 5-year plan only in 1928 Christian era, 11 years after its accession to power. Until then, it had no comprehensive working scheme whatever for the realization of socialism. Thrown back on experiment, it was forced to such desperately urgent maneuvers, improvisations, and changes of front, and defended by such tawdry and transparent apologetics that the general world movement passed out of its ken, The reader of this world history knows already how the moral and intellectual force of the Communist Party proved unequal after the death of Lenin. To control or resist the dictatorship of that forcible, worthy, devoted, and limited man, the Georgian Stalin. The premature death of the creative and adaptable Lenin, and the impatient suppression by Stalin of such intelligent, troublesome, but necessary types as Trotsky, a man who, but for lack of tact and essential dignity, might well have been Lenin's successor, crippled whatever hope there may have been that the modern state would first emerge in Russia. Terrible are the faithful disciples of creative men. Lenin relaxed and reversed the dogmatism of Marx. Stalin made what he imagined to be Leninism into a new and stiffer dogmatism. Thereafter, the political doctrinaire dominated and crippled the technician in a struggle that cried aloud for technical competence. Just as theological disputes impoverished and devastated Europe through the long centuries of Christendom and reduced the benefits of its unifying influence to zero, so in Russia, efficiency of organization was prevented by the pedantries of political theorists. The young were trained to a conceit and a xenophobia indistinguishable in its practical effects from the gross patriotism of such countries as France, Germany, Italy, or Scotland. Because of this subordination of its mental development to politics, Russia passed into a political and social phase comparable, as Rostovstev pointed out, at the time of his social and economic history of the Roman Empire, in its universal impoverishment and its lack of any critical vigor, to the well-meaning but devitalizing autocracy of the Emperor Diocletian. From its very start, the Russian Revolution failed in its ambition to lead mankind. Its cosmopolitanism lasted hardly longer than the cosmopolitanism of the Great French Revolution a dozen decades earlier. This almost inevitable lag of the constructive movement in Russia behind Western developments was foreseen by the shrewd and penetrating brain of Lenin, even in the phase of its apparent leadership. But his observation found little or no echo in the incurably liberal thought of the Marxian tradition. It was in Western Europe especially that the conception of the organized and disciplined world state as a revolutionary object ultimately grew to its full proportions. At first it grew obscurely. In 1933, any observer might have been misled by the fact of the fascist regime in Italy, by the tumult of the Nazi Party in Germany, by the similar National Socialist movements in other countries, and by the increase in tariff barriers and other restraints upon trade everywhere, to conclude that the cosmopolitan idea was everywhere in retreat before the obsessions of race, creed, and nationalism. Yet all the while, the germs of the modern state were growing. Everywhere, its votaries were learning and assembling force. It needed the financial storm of the years 1928 to 1927 Christian era and the steadily progressive collapse of the whole world's economic life, of which this storm was the prelude, to give the world state prophets the courage of their convictions. Then, indeed, they began to speak out. Instead of the restrained, partial, and inconclusive criticism of public affairs which had hitherto contented them, they now insisted plainly upon the need of a worldwide reconstruction, that is to say, of a world revolution, though revolution was still a word they shirked. The way in which this increased definition of aim and will came about is characteristic of the changing quality of social life. It was not that one or two outstanding men suddenly became audible and conspicuous as leaders in this awakening. There were no leaders. It was a widespread movement in human thought. The conclusions upon which intelligent people were converging may be briefly stated. They had arrived at the realization that human society had become one indivisible economic system with novel and enormous potentialities of well-being. By 1931 Christian era, this conception becomes visible even in the obstinately intellectualist mind of France. For example, in the parting speech to America of an obscure and transitory French Prime Minister, Laval, who crossed the Atlantic on some new undiscoverable mission in that year, and we find it promptly echoed by such preeminent loudspeakers as President Hoover of America and Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister. That idea, at any rate, had already become sufficiently popular for the politicians to render it lip service. but it was still only the intelligent minority who went on to the logical consequences of its realization. That is to say, the necessity of disavowing the sovereignty of contemporary governments, of setting up authoritative central controls to supplement or supersede them, and of putting the production of armaments, the production of the main economic staples, and the protection of workers from destructive underpayment beyond the reach of profit-seeking manipulation. Yet, by 1932 to 33, this understanding minority was speaking very plainly. These immense changes were no longer being presented as merely desirable things. They were presented as urgently necessary things if civilization was to be saved from an immense catastrophe. And not merely saved. The alternative to disaster, they saw even then, was not just a bleak and terrified security. That was the last thing possible. There was no alternative to disorder and wretchedness, but such an abundance, such a prosperity and richness of opportunity as man had never known before. These words are quoted from a Scottish newspaper of the year 1929. Enlightened people in 1932 Christian era were assured of the possibility of world order, universal sufficiency, and ever-increasing human validity, as are we who live today in ample possession of our lives amidst the practical realization of that possibility. Clearness of vision did not make for the happiness of the enlightened. Their minds were tormented not simply by contemporary fears and miseries, but by the sure knowledge of a possible world of free activity within the reach of man, and, as it were, magically withheld. They saw hundreds of millions of lives cramped and crippled, meagerly lived, sacrificed untimely, and they could not see any primary necessity for this blighting and starvation of human life. They saw youthful millions drifting to lives of violence, mutilation, and premature and hideous deaths. And beyond was our security, our eventfulness, and our freedom. Maxwell Brown, in a chapter called Tantalus, 1932, cites 40 instances of these realizations. But the legendary Tantalus was put within apparent reach of the unattainable by the inexorable decrees of the gods. Mankind was under no such pitiless destiny. The worldwide modern state shone bright upon the living imaginations of our race within a decade of the Great War, absurdly near, fantastically out of reach. For a century of passionate confusion and disorder, that modern state was not to be released from potentiality into actuality. It is to the story of these battling, lost and suffering generations, the generations of the half-light, that we must now proceed. When now we look back to the scattered and diverse individuals who first gave expression to this idea of the modern world state, which was dawning upon the human intelligence, when we appraise their first general efforts towards this realization, we need, before we can do them anything like justice, to attempt some measure of the ignorances, prejudices, and other inertias, the habits of concession and association, the herd love and the herd fear, with which they had to struggle not only in the society in which they found themselves, but within themselves. It is not a conflict of light and darkness we have to describe. It is the struggle of the purblind among the blind. We have to realize that for all that they were haunted by a vision of the civilized world of today, they still belonged not to our age, but to their own. The thing imagined in their minds was something quite distinct from their present reality. Maxwell Brown has devoted several chapters and a third great supplementary volume to a special selection of early modern state prophets who followed public careers. He showed conclusively that in the third and fourth decades of the 20th century Christian era, there was a rapidly increasing number of men and women with a clear general conception of the possibilities of the modern world. He gives their written and spoken words, often astoundingly prescient and explicit, and then he traces out the tenor of their lives subsequent to these utterances. The discrepancy of belief and effort is a useful and indeed a startling reminder of the conditional nature of the individual life. As he writes, in the security and serenity of the study, these men and women could see plainly. In those hours of withdrawal, the fragile delicate brain matter could escape from immediacy, apprehended caution in 4 dimensions, reach forward to the permanent values of social events in the space-time framework. But even to this study, there penetrated the rumble of the outer disorder, and directly the door was opened, forthwith the uproar of contemporary existence, the carnival, the riot, the war in the market, beat in triumphantly. The raging question of what had to be done that day scattered the fine thought of our common destiny to the four winds of heaven. Maxwell Brown adds a vivid illustration to this passage. It is the facsimile of the first draft by Peter Rawn, the American progressive leader of the Revolutionary Manifesto of 1937. It was indisputably a very inspiring document in its time, and Rawn gave last proof of loyalty to the best in his mind, by a courageous martyrdom. But in the margin of this draft, one's attention is caught by a maze of little figures, little sums in multiplication and addition. By his almost inspired gift for evidence, and through the industry of his group of research assistants, Maxwell Brown has been able to demonstrate exactly what these sums were. They show that even while Rawn, so far as his foresight permitted, was planning our new world, his thoughts were not wholly fixed on that end. They wandered. For a time, the manifesto was neglected while he did these sums. He was gambling in industrial inequities, and a large portion of his brain was considering whether the time had arrived